The fluorescent lights in the bank lobby buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh white glow across my trembling hands as I stared at the computer screen that had just destroyed my world. The numbers didn't lie, even though I desperately wanted them to. Balance? 127.43. Yesterday, it had been 127.43. $70,000. Gone. I blinked hard, hoping my tired eyes had made some terrible mistake, that the stress of the upcoming surgery had somehow affected my vision. But the stark reality remained unchanged on that merciless screen, each digit a nail in the coffin of my hope. Those savings represented 3 years of cutting every corner imaginable, of choosing between medications and meals, of wearing the same winter coat until the lining fell out because every dollar I could save was another day closer to the surgery that might give me my life back. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" The young teller's voice seemed to come from underwater, distant and muffled by the roaring in my ears. She couldn't have been more than 25, probably younger than my son Leo when he first learned to say mama, with those chubby little fingers reaching for my face. Now those same hands had reached into my account and stolen my future. I managed to shake my head, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to explain that my own child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father walked out when things got tough, had just condemned me to death, because that's what this theft really meant. Without that surgery fund, without the procedure Dr. Martinez had scheduled for next month, the tumor growing in my chest would continue its relentless expansion until breathing became impossible. Could you check the withdrawal history, please?" My voice came out as barely a whisper, though inside my chest a scream was building that threatened to tear me apart from the inside out. I already knew what she'd find, but I needed to see it confirmed in black and white. Needed the official record of my son's betrayal spelled out in transaction details. The teller's fingers clicked across her keyboard with the efficiency of someone who'd never had to watch their entire future disappear in a few keystrokes. "It shows a large withdrawal yesterday at 2:17 p.m. for $70,000. The transaction was authorized with the correct PIN and identification. It appears to have been processed without any issues." Without any issues. As if the complete destruction of a mother's trust and hope was just another routine banking procedure. As if families betrayed each other every day at 2:17 p.m. on Tuesday afternoons, while their mothers were at home preparing dinner and wondering if their sons would call that evening like they usually did. I fumbled for my phone with hands that seemed to belong to someone else, someone whose nervous system hadn't just been shattered by the casual cruelty of unconditional love being rewarded with calculated theft. Leo's contact information glowed on the screen. My boy with a heart emoji, a designation that now felt like a sick joke. When had I last updated that entry? Probably years ago, back when I still believed that raising a child with kindness and sacrifice would somehow guarantee his loyalty in return. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before clicking over to voicemail. His recorded voice, cheerful and confident, invited me to leave a message and promised he'd get back to me soon. Soon. How long would soon be when your mother was calling to ask why you'd stolen her life savings? How long would it take him to manufacture an explanation that would somehow make this betrayal feel justified? "Leo, it's Mom." My voice cracked on the word, the title that had once filled me with such pride now feeling hollow and meaningless. "I'm at the bank. The money, all of it, it's gone. I need you to call me. Please, I need you to call me right now." I ended the call and stood in that fluorescent-lit lobby, surrounded by other customers conducting their normal banking business, depositing paychecks, applying for loans, planning futures they had every reason to believe would unfold according to their careful preparations. None of them had to worry about their own children stealing their medication money. None of them were trying to figure out how to tell an oncologist that the surgery they'd scheduled would have to be postponed indefinitely because family love had proven to be conditional after all. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment below to let us know what city you're watching from. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets that suddenly seemed foreign, as if I were seeing my own neighborhood through the eyes of someone whose fundamental understanding of human nature had just been permanently altered. Every landmark along the route, the grocery store where I'd taught Leo to count change when he was 7, the park where I'd pushed him on swings until my arms ached, the library where we'd spent countless Saturday afternoons reading together. now served as monuments to my own naivety. I'd believed that love was enough. I'd believed that giving everything I had to raise him properly would somehow guarantee his character, would ensure that when I needed him most, he'd remember all those nights I'd stayed up with him through fevers and nightmares and adolescent heartbreaks. I'd been saving for this surgery since his college graduation, since the day the doctors first found the mass and explained that early intervention could mean the difference between a full recovery and a slow, suffocating decline. Every dollar I'd managed to squirrel away had felt like a small victory, proof that even on a limited income, even as a single mother who'd never remarried because no relationship had ever seemed worth the risk of exposing Leo to potential instability, I could still take care of myself. I could still fight for my own survival with the same determination I'd shown in fighting for his future. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, as if the theft had somehow poisoned the very air inside rooms where Leo had grown from a curious toddler into the man who'd just destroyed my faith in everything I'd thought I knew about family bonds. His childhood artwork still hung on the refrigerator. Finger paintings and crayon drawings I'd been too sentimental to remove even after he'd moved out and started his own life. First place ribbons from elementary school science fairs lined the hallway, each one representing hours of help with research and presentation. Late nights spent building volcanoes and solar system models, while I worked my shift at the diner and dreamed about the day when his education would open doors I'd never been able to walk through myself. Had any of that effort meant anything to him? Had any of those sacrifices registered as love? Or had he simply cataloged them as obligations he'd never asked for and therefore never owed anything in return? My phone remained silent through the evening, its screen dark and accusatory every time I glanced at it, hoping to see his name appear with some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. No frantic callback with news that his account had been hacked, that someone had stolen his identity and used it to access money that didn't belong to them. No tearful confession followed by a promise to return every penny plus interest. Just silence that stretched through the hours like a knife blade slowly turning in my chest. At midnight, when sleep remained as elusive as an explanation for his behavior, I called again. This time the phone went straight to voicemail, which meant he'd either turned it off or seen my name on the caller ID and chosen to ignore me. Both possibilities felt like additional betrayals. Confirmation that this hadn't been some desperate impulse he immediately regretted, but a calculated decision he was prepared to defend. Leo, I don't understand what's happening. My voice echoed in the empty house, bouncing off walls that had once felt like sanctuary, but now seemed more like a prison where I'd been left to contemplate my own failure as a mother. I need that money for the surgery. You know how important this is. You know what happens if I can't. Please, just call me back. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it together. We always have. But even as I spoke those words, I realized they represented a fantasy I could no longer maintain. We hadn't fixed this together. He'd created this crisis entirely on his own, without consultation or consideration for anyone except himself. And now, I was the one left to deal with the consequences of his choices. The one who'd have to call Dr. Martinez's office in the morning and explain that the surgery they'd scheduled would have to be canceled because my own son had stolen my medical fund. The silence that followed my second voicemail felt heavier than the first, weighted with the growing certainty that whatever relationship I'd thought we had, whatever bond I'd believed was unbreakable, had been shattered by 30 seconds of electronic banking. In the darkness of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling where shadows played like ghosts of better times, I began to understand that some betrayals can't be forgiven, not because the wound is too deep, but because the person who caused it has revealed something fundamental about their character that makes reconciliation impossible. Tomorrow would bring new humiliations, phone calls to postpone medical appointments, conversations with insurance representatives about coverage extensions, the crushing weight of explaining to medical professionals that a patient they'd prioritized based on urgency would no longer be able to afford the treatment that might save her life. But tonight, in the silence my son had chosen instead of explanation, I made a decision that would change everything between us forever. 3 days passed before Leo finally returned my calls, and when he did, his voice carried the casual indifference of someone discussing weekend plans rather than the theft of his mother's life savings. No urgency, no panic, no recognition that he'd just committed what felt like emotional murder. Just that same confident tone I'd heard him use with telemarketers and door-to-door salesmen. Polite but distant, as if I were an inconvenience he needed to manage rather than the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him. "Mom, I got your messages." He didn't apologize for the delay, didn't explain where he'd been while I'd spent 72 hours wondering if my only child had been in an accident, or simply couldn't bear to face what he'd done. "Look, I know you're upset about the money, but I can explain everything." Upset. As if discovering that your son had stolen your cancer treatment fund was equivalent to being annoyed about a missed dinner reservation or a forgotten birthday. The word felt like another slap, another confirmation that the gravity of his actions hadn't registered with him at all. In his mind, this was apparently just another disagreement we'd work through, another bump in the road that would smooth itself out with time and his particular brand of charm. Upset? My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. Years of suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. "Leo, you took $70,000 from my medical account, money I've been saving for 3 years, money I need for surgery that could save my life. That's not upset. That's devastated." There was a pause on his end, the kind of silence that suggested he was calculating his response rather than feeling genuine remorse. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, adopting the patient condescension he'd perfected during his business school years, the voice he used when explaining complex concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior. "I understand you're emotional right now, but you need to think about this rationally. This wasn't some random decision. It was an investment opportunity that couldn't wait. My business partner found this incredible deal, but we needed liquid capital immediately. The returns are going to be massive, Mom. We're talking about doubling, maybe tripling the initial investment within 6 months. Investment opportunity." He'd turned my medical emergency into a business venture without consulting me, without considering that the money he was gambling with represented my only chance at survival. The casual way he discussed it, as if my life savings were just idle funds sitting around waiting for him to find a better use for them, made my chest tighten with something that went beyond anger into pure disbelief. "What if the investment fails?" I asked, though I already knew his answer would be some variation of confident dismissal, some assurance that failure wasn't possible because he'd done his research and calculated the risks. "What if you lose everything? What happens to my surgery then?" "It won't fail." The certainty in his voice was absolute, the kind of blind confidence that had served him well in school presentations and job interviews, but felt terrifying when applied to my medical future. "Mom, you worry too much. You always have. This is exactly the kind of thinking that's kept you stuck in the same place your whole life, afraid to take risks, afraid to trust other people's expertise, stuck in the same place." The phrase hit me like a physical blow, carrying implications that went far beyond our current crisis. This wasn't just about the money. This was about how he saw me, how he'd apparently always seen me. Not as the woman who'd worked double shifts to pay for his college education, not as the mother who'd foregone her own dreams to ensure his success, but as someone whose caution and careful planning represented character flaws that needed to be overcome. "I trusted your expertise when you asked me to co-sign your student loans," I said quietly, remembering the pride I'd felt when he'd been accepted to business school, the way I'd signed those documents without hesitation because I believed in his potential. "I trusted your expertise when you needed money for your first apartment deposit. I've been trusting your expertise your entire life, Leo. What I didn't expect was for you to steal from me. I didn't steal anything." His voice sharpened with the first hint of real emotion he'd shown during the conversation, but it wasn't guilt or shame. It was irritation at having his actions labeled accurately. "I took money from an account I have access to and put it towards something that's going to benefit both of us. You gave me that access years ago, remember? You said you trusted me to help manage your finances if anything ever happened to you." The access. I did remember giving him that permission, back when I'd first been diagnosed and the doctors had warned me about the possibility of extended hospital stays or treatments that might leave me temporarily incapacitated. It had felt like responsible planning at the time, like the kind of precaution any single mother would take to ensure her affairs could be handled if she became unable to manage them herself. I'd never imagined he'd interpret that emergency authorization as permission to raid my accounts for his business ventures. I'd never dreamed that the trust I'd extended as a safety net would become the rope he'd use to hang my future. The legal paperwork that was supposed to protect me had become the weapon he'd used to destroy everything I'd worked for. "That access was for emergencies," I said. my voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of his betrayal began to sink in. Medical emergencies, situations where I couldn't handle my own affairs, not so you could fund your business deals. This is an emergency, Mom. A financial emergency. You just don't see it that way because you don't understand how business works. His tone had shifted again, becoming almost professorial, as if he were explaining basic economics to a child. You've been sitting on that money for 3 years, letting it lose value to inflation, when it could have been growing. The surgery can wait a few more months. Investments like this can't. The surgery can wait. 4 words that revealed everything I needed to know about how my son valued my life compared to his financial ambitions. The tumor in my chest wouldn't wait for his profit margins to materialize. The breathing difficulties that woke me up gasping in the middle of the night wouldn't pause while he calculated returns on investment. My mortality operated on a different timeline than his business plans, but somehow that fundamental reality had escaped his consideration entirely. The surgery can't wait, Leo. I found myself speaking slowly, carefully, as if I were translating a foreign language. Dr. Martinez explained that the tumor is growing. Every month we delay treatment makes the procedure more complicated, more dangerous. This isn't about convenience. It's about survival. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of practiced patience that suggested he'd anticipated this objection and prepared his response. Look, I talked to a friend of mine whose dad had something similar. There are payment plans available for medical procedures. Insurance covers a lot more than people think. You're acting like this surgery is the only option when there are probably alternatives you haven't even considered. Payment plans, insurance coverage, alternatives. He was discussing my medical crisis like a math problem that could be solved through creative financing rather than acknowledging that he'd stolen the money I'd spent 3 years accumulating, specifically to avoid those complications. He'd researched business investments but apparently hadn't bothered to understand the details of my medical situation or the insurance limitations I'd already explored with Dr. Martinez's billing department. I've already checked into all of that, I said, exhaustion beginning to replace anger as the futility of this conversation became clear. My insurance has a $20,000 deductible for this type of surgery. The payment plans require a substantial down payment that I no longer have because you took it. The alternatives you're talking about aren't alternatives. They're delays that could cost me my life. You're being dramatic. The dismissal was swift and final, delivered with the authority of someone who'd never had to contemplate his own mortality or navigate a medical system that prioritized profit over patient care. People figure out ways to pay for medical treatment every day. You'll find a solution. You always do. But this investment opportunity was time-sensitive. It couldn't wait for family discussions and committee meetings. Family discussions, committee meetings. As if asking for permission before stealing someone's medical fund was some kind of bureaucratic inefficiency rather than basic human decency. As if the mother who'd raised him deserved the same consideration he'd give to a business partner or investor, rather than being treated like a resource to be exploited when convenient. That's when I realized that somewhere along the way, without my noticing, I'd stopped being his mother in any meaningful sense and become simply another asset he could leverage for his personal gain. The boy who'd once cried in my arms when other children were cruel to him had grown into a man who could be cruel to me without apparent conscience. The relationship I'd treasured as the most important thing in my life had become for him just another transaction to be managed. I need that money back, Leo. I said it simply, without drama or threats. Just a statement of fact delivered by a woman who'd finally understood that begging wouldn't work on someone who'd already demonstrated his complete indifference to her suffering. I need it back within the week so I can reschedule the surgery. That's not possible. His response was immediate, automatic, as if he'd been prepared for this demand and had already dismissed it as unreasonable. The money's already been invested. It's tied up in contracts and partnerships. I can't just pull it out because you're having second thoughts about the timeline. Second thoughts about the timeline. My impending death had been reduced to a scheduling conflict in his mind. Something that could be rearranged to accommodate his business plans rather than a medical emergency that required immediate action. The casual cruelty of that phrase would stay with me long after our conversation ended, a perfect encapsulation of how completely he'd lost the ability to see me as a human being rather than an obstacle to his success. When I hung up the phone that night, I understood with crystalline clarity that I was completely alone in this fight for my life. The next morning brought the humiliation I'd been dreading, calling Dr. Martinez's office to explain why I needed to postpone the surgery that had been scheduled with such careful precision. The receptionist, Maria, had been handling my appointments for 2 years, and I could hear the confusion in her voice when I asked to speak with the scheduling coordinator about a delay in my treatment timeline. "Mrs. Rodriguez, is everything all right? Dr. Martinez specifically prioritized your case because of the growth rate he observed in your last scan. He was very concerned about waiting too long." Maria's voice carried the gentle concern of someone who'd watched too many patients postpone necessary treatments for financial reasons, who understood that behind every delayed surgery was a story of impossible choices and systematic failures. I found myself staring at the kitchen wall where Leo's elementary school honor roll certificates still hung, faded reminders of a time when I'd believed academic achievement would translate into character development. How naive I'd been to think that teaching a child to excel in school would somehow ensure he'd grow into an adult who cared about anyone other than himself. "There's been a financial complication," I said, the words feeling like broken glass in my throat. "I need to explore other payment options before we can proceed." I couldn't bring myself to say that my own son had stolen my medical fund. Some humiliations were too complete to share with strangers, even kind ones who were trying to help. The silence on Maria's end lasted long enough for me to understand that she'd heard this story before, that I wasn't the first patient whose family had prioritized other concerns over life-saving medical care. When she spoke again, her voice carried a professional sadness that suggested she'd learned to deliver bad news with compassion, while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to function in a system that broke hearts daily. "I'll transfer you to our financial counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez. Sandra might be able to work something out. Payment plans, charitable assistance programs, maybe something through the hospital foundation. Don't give up hope yet. Don't give up hope yet." The phrase felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in circumstances beyond their control, but also like a reminder that hope was becoming increasingly fragile with each conversation, each closed door, each confirmation that the support systems I'd counted on were either inadequate or inaccessible to someone in my situation. Sandra Williamson had the weary competence of someone who spent her days explaining to desperate people why their medical crises couldn't be resolved through creative financing. She listened to my situation with the patience of a professional counselor, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my insurance coverage and employment status, building a complete picture of my financial limitations before delivering her verdict. "Your insurance will cover 60% of the surgical costs, which leaves you responsible for approximately $48,000, she explained, her voice carrying the neutral tone that medical billing departments use to discuss life and death decisions as if they were routine administrative matters. "Our standard payment plan requires a $10,000 down payment, which you've indicated isn't currently available. $10,000. Even that reduced amount might as well have been $10 million, given my current circumstances. My savings account held the pathetic remainder Leo had left behind, enough for maybe 3 weeks of groceries if I was careful, but nowhere near sufficient to satisfy medical billing requirements designed for people whose children hadn't stolen their emergency funds. "Are there any charitable programs that might help?" I asked, though I already sensed from her tone that such options would be limited or unavailable to someone who technically had insurance coverage, even if that coverage was inadequate for my specific situation. "The hospital foundation does have some assistance available, but the waiting list is currently 8 to 10 months long. Most of those funds are reserved for patients with no insurance at all, or for pediatric cases that receive priority consideration." Sandra's explanation was delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this information countless times, who understood that most patients couldn't wait 8 months for charitable intervention when their medical conditions were deteriorating. 8 to 10 months. The tumor wouldn't wait for charitable organizations to process my application and determine my worthiness for assistance. Dr. Martinez had been clear that every month of delay increased the complexity of the surgery and reduced the likelihood of a complete recovery. By the time foundation funding became available, I might need a completely different kind of treatment, or no treatment at all, if the cancer had progressed beyond the point where intervention remained possible. "There is one other option," Sandra continued, and something in her voice suggested she was approaching territory that made her professionally uncomfortable. Some patients have had success with online fundraising platforms, GoFundMe, medical crowdfunding sites. It's not something we officially recommend, but I've seen families raise substantial amounts when they're able to share their stories effectively. Online fundraising. The modern equivalent of passing a hat, except instead of appealing to neighbors and church congregations, I'd be broadcasting my desperation to strangers on the internet, competing with thousands of other medical crises for the attention of people who might spare a few dollars if my story seemed compelling enough to warrant their sympathy. The idea felt degrading in ways I couldn't fully articulate, not because asking for help was inherently shameful, but because I'd already given help to the one person who should have been helping me. I'd funded Leo's education, supported his dreams, invested in his future with the expectation that family bonds meant something more than convenient access to someone else's resources when business opportunities arose. "I'll think about it," I told Sandra, though we both knew that thinking wouldn't change the fundamental mathematics of my situation. I needed $48,000 for a surgery that couldn't wait, and none of the official channels could provide that kind of assistance within any reasonable time frame. After I hung up, I sat in my empty house and tried to imagine composing a crowdfunding appeal that would explain why strangers should care about my medical crisis when my own son clearly didn't. What could I write that would inspire compassion without revealing the devastating family betrayal that had created my current circumstances? How could I ask for help without admitting that the person who'd stolen from me was the same person I'd sacrificed everything to raise properly? The afternoon brought a visit from my neighbor, Ellen Morrison, who'd noticed that I hadn't been checking my mail regularly and wanted to make sure I was feeling all right. Ellen was 73, a retired teacher who'd lived next door for 15 years and had watched Leo grow from a gangly teenager into what she'd always described as a fine young man with such good manners. "I saw Leo's car in your driveway last week," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd shared countless cups of coffee and neighborhood gossip over the years. "How's he doing? Still working for that investment firm downtown?" The question hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront how completely my understanding of Leo's character had diverged from how other people saw him. To Ellen, he was still the polite boy who'd helped her carry groceries and always remembered to ask about her arthritis when he visited. She had no idea that her fine young man had just stolen his mother's cancer treatment fund to finance business ventures that were more important to him than her survival. "He's doing well," I heard myself say, the lie coming automatically because the truth was too shameful to share with someone who'd spent decades watching our family navigate life's challenges with what she'd assumed was mutual love and support. "Very busy with work." Ellen nodded approvingly, her face lighting up with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in young people had been validated by Leo's apparent success. "I always knew that boy would make something of himself. You raised him right, Marisa. You should be proud of how he turned out." Proud. The word felt like acid in my chest, burning away whatever remaining illusions I'd maintained about my effectiveness as a mother or Leo's development as a human being. Ellen's praise highlighted the gap between public perception and private reality, between the son I'd thought I'd raised and the man who could steal from his dying mother without apparent conscience. "He's always been driven," I managed, which was technically true, even though his drive had apparently led him to destroy the person who'd made his success possible. Very focused on his goals. We sat in silence for a moment, Ellen probably remembering Leo's childhood achievements while I contemplated the adult monster those achievements had somehow produced. The contrast felt surreal. This kind woman celebrating the character of someone who'd just committed what felt like matricide through financial theft, while I struggled to reconcile her memories with my current reality. "You know," Ellen said suddenly, leaning forward with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share valuable information, "my nephew works in hospital administration, and he's always talking about how many people struggle with medical bills even when they have insurance. He says there are advocates you can hire, people who know how to negotiate with billing departments and find programs that regular patients never hear about. Medical advocates. Another service I couldn't afford. Another solution that required resources I no longer possessed thanks to Leo's theft." Ellen's suggestion was well-intentioned, but it highlighted how completely my son's actions had cut off every possible avenue for addressing my medical crisis. Each potential solution required money I didn't have, connections I couldn't access, or time I couldn't spare while the tumor continued its relentless growth. "That's a good idea," I said, not wanting to explain why professional advocacy was beyond my current means. "I'll look into it." Ellen stayed for another hour, filling the silence with neighborhood news and gentle inquiries about my health that I deflected with vague reassurances. When she finally left, pressing my hand and reminding me to call if I needed anything, I realized that her kindness had somehow made my isolation feel more complete. Here was a woman who barely knew me offering more genuine concern than my own son had shown, a neighbor who cared more about my well-being than the person whose life I'd dedicated myself to building. That evening, I found myself standing in Leo's old bedroom, looking at the desk where he'd studied for the SATs while I worked double shifts to pay for test prep courses. The walls still displayed his academic awards and college acceptance letters, evidence of a young man who'd seemed destined for success and moral leadership. Now I understood that all those achievements had been building toward this moment, when he'd finally proved that education without empathy created monsters capable of destroying the people who'd sacrificed everything to create their opportunities. The room felt like a shrine to my own naivety, a museum of misplaced faith in the power of love to shape character. In the silence of that space where I'd once tucked a little boy into bed, while promising him that everything would be all right, I began to understand that some promises couldn't be kept, and some relationships couldn't survive the revelation of who people really were beneath the surface they presented to the world. 2 weeks passed without another word from Leo, and I began to understand that his silence wasn't temporary embarrassment or guilt, it was strategic avoidance. He'd taken what he wanted, and now I was simply a problem to be managed through distance and neglect. The realization settled into my bones like winter cold, the kind of chill that no amount of blankets or hot tea could chase away. I'd started rationing everything: food, electricity, even hope. My refrigerator held the bare minimum: generic bread, peanut butter, and whatever vegetables were marked down for quick sale. I'd learned to eat one meal a day, telling myself it was temporary, that somehow a solution would present itself if I could just hold on long enough. But the tumor didn't care about my reduced circumstances. It continued growing with the indifference of something that had never learned to negotiate or compromise. The breathing episodes were getting worse. I'd wake up gasping, my chest tight and burning, fighting for air that seemed to get thinner each night. During the day, climbing the stairs to my bedroom left me dizzy and exhausted, forcing me to rest halfway up like someone 3 times my age. My body was failing on the same timeline Dr. Martinez had predicted, regardless of whether I could afford to address the crisis destroying me from the inside. I'd tried calling Leo twice more, leaving messages that grew progressively more desperate, despite my attempts to maintain dignity. The first was still measured, still hopeful that he might have developed some kind of conscience during his voluntary absence from my life. The second was rawer, more honest about my deteriorating condition and the urgency of my medical situation. "Leo, it's Mom again. I'm having trouble breathing at night. The episodes are getting longer, more frequent. Dr. Martinez said this would happen if we delayed treatment too long. I need you to call me back. I need you to help me figure out how to fix this before it's too late." But my phone remained silent, the screen dark and accusatory every time I checked for missed calls or messages that never came. He'd blocked me from his life as efficiently as he'd emptied my bank account, removing every trace of our relationship that might inconvenience his new reality. 3 weeks after our last conversation, I received a package in the mail with Leo's return address, the first contact he'd initiated since stealing my surgery fund. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird, the desperate possibility that maybe he'd found a way to return the money, that maybe some vestige of the boy I'd raised still existed beneath the calculating stranger he'd become. Inside the package was a cheap digital photo frame loaded with pictures from his childhood, accompanied by a card that read, "Happy early birthday, Mom. Thought you'd enjoy having these memories in one place. Love, Leo." My birthday was still 6 months away, and the gift felt like the kind of thoughtless gesture someone might choose from an airport gift shop. Functional, but impersonal, selected by someone who'd forgotten everything meaningful about our relationship. The photos were all from his perspective, images that highlighted his achievements and milestones, rather than capturing our bond or the sacrifices I'd made to create those opportunities. His first day of school, his graduation from high school, his college acceptance letter, his first job promotion, A curated collection of his success story with me relegated to background presence, the supporting character in his personal narrative of triumph. There was nothing recent, nothing that acknowledged our current crisis or suggested he understood the gravity of what he'd done, just a sanitized version of our history that erased every difficult moment, every sacrifice, every indication that his success had come at the cost of someone else's well-being. It was the gift equivalent of his voicemail, technically thoughtful, but emotionally hollow, a gesture designed to fulfill obligation without requiring genuine engagement. I plugged in the frame and watched his childhood cycle past on the small screen, each image a reminder of how completely I'd misunderstood what I was building. That little boy who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant had grown into a man who could steal his mother's medical fund without losing sleep. The teenager who'd written me Mother's Day cards promising to always take care of me had become someone who viewed my survival as less important than his investment opportunities. The card lay on my kitchen table for days, its cheerful message becoming more surreal each time I read it. Love, Leo. What did that word mean to someone who could express affection through meaningless gifts while refusing to return phone calls from the mother whose life he'd systematically destroyed? How did he reconcile signing cards with sentiment while maintaining absolute silence about the medical crisis his theft had created? The photo frame became a source of torture rather than comfort, its automatic slideshow cycling through happier times while I struggled to breathe through nights that grew progressively more difficult. I'd catch glimpses of his gap-toothed smile from second grade and remember how proud I'd been when his teacher said he was the most empathetic child in her class, how he'd always been the first to comfort classmates who were hurt or upset. Where had that empathy gone? At what point had his natural compassion been replaced by the calculating coldness that allowed him to steal from the woman who'd given him everything? The photos suggested a different person entirely, someone who'd been replaced by an imposter wearing his face while possessing none of his heart. I started having dreams about the little boy in those pictures, dreams where he apologized for what his adult self had done, where he promised to fix everything and make it right. I'd wake up reaching for a phone that wouldn't ring, expecting to find missed calls from someone who'd remembered how to care about anyone other than himself. But morning always brought the same empty silence, the same abandoned relationship, the same medical crisis that grew worse while he pursued business ventures with my stolen money. The worst part wasn't the physical deterioration or even the financial devastation. It was the complete erasure of everything I'd thought I knew about motherhood and family bonds. I'd believed that love was enough, that raising a child with kindness and sacrifice would somehow guarantee his loyalty when I needed it most. I'd believed that the countless nights I'd stayed up with him through childhood illnesses would be remembered when I faced my own health crisis. I'd been wrong about everything. One evening, while the photo frame cycled through images of birthdays and Christmas mornings that now felt like scenes from someone else's life, I had what felt like my final conversation with the universe. Not prayer exactly, since I'd never been particularly religious, but a desperate accounting of everything I'd given versus everything I'd received in return. I did my best, I said to the empty house, my voice barely a whisper in the darkness. I worked double shifts to pay for his school clothes. I missed my own birthday parties to attend his soccer games. I gave up dating because I didn't want him to feel like he was competing for attention. I saved every penny I could for his college education while wearing the same coat for 5 years because new clothing felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. The photos continued their silent rotation, mocking my litany of sacrifice with images of a boy who'd apparently learned nothing from witnessing his mother's devotion. Each picture was evidence of love that had been wasted on someone incapable of reciprocating basic human decency. Investment in a character that had never actually developed despite all my careful attention. I thought I was raising someone who would care about other people, I continued, addressing the darkness that felt more responsive than my own son had become. I thought I was building someone who would remember kindness when it was time to show some himself. I thought family meant something more than convenient access to other people's resources, but the house offered no answers, no comfort, no suggestion that my faith in love and sacrifice had been anything other than naive delusion. The silence felt complete and final, as if the universe itself had given up on the idea that good people deserved good outcomes, that mothers who sacrificed everything for their children could expect anything in return except abandonment when their usefulness expired. I turned off the photo frame that night and put it in a drawer, unable to bear watching any more evidence of my own stupidity cycle passed on its cheerful little screen. The boy in those pictures had been an illusion, a character I'd created through wishful thinking and selective memory. The real Leo, the one who could steal from his dying mother without conscience, had always been there beneath the surface, waiting for the right opportunity to reveal his true nature. In the darkness of my bedroom, listening to my labored breathing echo off walls that felt like they were closing in, I understood that some stories don't have happy endings. Some mothers raise monsters despite their best efforts. Some sacrifices are wasted on people who will never understand their value. Some love is given to those who will never be capable of returning it. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped hoping that Leo would call. I stopped believing that some version of the boy I'd raised still existed somewhere inside the man who'd destroyed my future. I stopped waiting for apologies or explanations or gestures that might restore my faith in family bonds. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I finally had nothing left to protect. And sometimes, when you have nothing left to protect, you discover reserves of strength you never knew existed. Sometimes rock bottom becomes the foundation for something entirely new, but I still had something they'd forgotten about, something that would change everything. The thing they'd forgotten about was paperwork, not the kind that grants access to bank accounts or medical decisions. Leo had been careful to maintain control over those, but the kind that accumulates over decades of shared financial responsibility, the documents that pile up in filing cabinets when someone trusts you completely and never questions your judgment about investments, tax preparations, or business dealings. For 18 years, I'd been more than Leo's mother. I'd been his financial safety net, his credit reference, his guarantor on everything from student loans to apartment leases to the business loan he'd taken out 2 years ago to start his investment consulting firm. My signature was on documents I'd barely read, my name attached to obligations I'd never fully understood, my credit score bolstering his credibility with lenders who needed assurance that someone responsible stood behind his ambitions. I'd signed those papers with pride, believing I was helping launch a successful career for someone who would remember my support when it mattered. Now, sitting in my kitchen with a stack of financial documents spread across the table like tarot cards predicting a different kind of future, I began to understand that trust could be weaponized in both directions. The business loan was the most interesting discovery. $75,000 borrowed against future earnings, with me listed as cosigner and guarantor. The monthly payments were supposed to come from Leo's business profits, but according to the bank statements I'd received as cosigner, statements I'd never opened because I'd trusted him to manage everything properly, those payments had become increasingly irregular over the past 6 months. 3 payments missed entirely. 2 others paid late with substantial penalty fees. The loan was technically in default, which meant the bank could demand full repayment at any time. And as cosigner, I wasn't just a reference. I was equally liable for the entire debt if Leo couldn't or wouldn't satisfy his obligations. I'd never understood the power that paperwork could represent until I started reading the fine print I'd ignored when I was focused on being a supportive mother rather than a careful business partner. Every document I'd signed while thinking about Leo's future had created legal connections between us that persisted regardless of his current behavior toward me. The apartment lease for his downtown loft was another revelation. My income had been required to meet the landlord's qualification standards. My credit history had secured the favorable terms he'd negotiated, and my signature on the guarantor agreement meant I was responsible for rent payments if he defaulted. The monthly amount was more than my entire Social Security income, money I'd never seen but was contractually obligated to cover if necessary. Even his car loan included my name as cosigner, a detail I'd forgotten from 3 years ago when his credit hadn't been sufficient to secure the luxury sedan he'd wanted for professional appearances. The vehicle was registered in his name, but the debt was shared between us, another financial thread connecting our lives regardless of his desire to pretend our relationship no longer existed. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. Not hope exactly, but a different kind of clarity. The sharp focus that comes when you stop being a victim and start being a strategist. Leo had built his entire adult life on the foundation of my support, my credit, my willingness to sign documents that made his success possible. He'd forgotten that foundations could be removed as deliberately as they'd been laid. I spent the next 3 days researching my rights as cosigner and guarantor, using the public library's internet access to navigate legal websites and financial advice forums. The information I found was both empowering and sobering. I had more leverage than I'd realized, but using it would require careful planning and precise timing. Cosigners weren't just passive guarantors waiting to pay other people's debts. Under certain circumstances, we could demand immediate full payment, force the liquidation of assets, or take legal action to protect our interests when the primary borrower demonstrated financial irresponsibility. Leo's theft of my medical fund could arguably constitute exactly that kind of irresponsible behavior. More importantly, his business loan included a morality clause that I'd never noticed when I'd signed the original documents. The bank had included language protecting themselves against borrowers who engaged in fraudulent or unethical financial behavior, including theft from family members or misuse of joint accounts. If I could demonstrate that Leo had stolen my surgery fund, the bank could declare his loan in immediate default and demand full repayment within 30 days. The wheels in my mind began turning with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades solving problems through careful planning rather than dramatic confrontation. I wasn't interested in revenge exactly. I was interested in justice, in using the same legal systems that Leo had exploited to create consequences he hadn't anticipated. I began keeping detailed records of everything: copies of bank statements showing the theft, documentation of my medical situation and the canceled surgery, records of my attempts to contact him and his refusal to respond. If this became a legal matter, I wanted evidence that would demonstrate the pattern of his behavior clearly and convincingly. The changed woman who emerged from that research wasn't the broken mother who'd been begging for her son's attention. This was someone who understood that family relationships didn't exempt anyone from basic accountability, that trust came with obligations that persisted even when love had been withdrawn. I called the bank holding Leo's business loan and scheduled an appointment with a loan officer, explaining that I needed to discuss my responsibilities as cosigner and some concerns about the borrower's recent financial behavior. The conversation was scheduled for the following week, giving me time to organize my documentation and prepare my presentation. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting to Leo's choices. I was making my own. The shift felt profound, like discovering muscles I'd forgotten I possessed. The helpless victim who'd been pleading for scraps of attention from someone who'd stolen her future had been replaced by someone who understood that power came from knowledge, preparation, and willingness to act on principle rather than sentiment. I also reached out to a legal aid attorney who specialized in family financial disputes, someone recommended by the hospital's financial counselor who'd seen similar cases of theft between relatives. The initial consultation was free, and during our conversation, I learned that California law took a particularly dim view of children who stole from elderly parents, especially when those parents were facing medical emergencies. The case you're describing could potentially involve elder abuse charges, Attorney Michelle Roberts explained during our phone consultation. Financial exploitation of vulnerable adults is a serious criminal matter, not just a civil dispute between family members. Elder abuse. The phrase felt strange applied to my situation, carrying implications of frailty and helplessness that didn't match how I saw myself. But legally, it described exactly what had happened. An adult child had exploited his access to his mother's financial resources for personal gain while she was facing a life-threatening medical crisis. The criminal charges would be handled by the district attorney's office, Michelle continued, but there are also civil remedies available, including the possibility of forcing asset liquidation to recover stolen funds, especially when the theft involved money earmarked for medical treatment. Asset liquidation. Leo's downtown loft, his luxury car, his business equipment, everything he'd acquired using my support as financial foundation could potentially be seized and sold to compensate for the medical fund he'd stolen. The irony was perfect. The success he'd built on my sacrifices could be dismantled to restore what he'd taken from me. I scheduled an in-person meeting with Michelle for the following week, understanding that I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Once I filed formal complaints about Leo's theft, our relationship would be permanently destroyed. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what I was finally willing to do in response. The old Marissa would have hesitated, would have worried about burning bridges or damaging family bonds that might someday be repaired. But that woman had died the moment Leo chose his investment opportunities over his mother's survival. The person I was becoming understood that some bridges deserved to be burned, that some relationships were already so damaged that formal acknowledgement of their destruction was simply honest accounting. That evening, I sat in my kitchen and wrote a letter that I didn't intend to send. Not yet. It was addressed to Leo, but it was really for me, a way of organizing my thoughts and clarifying my intentions before taking actions that would change both our lives permanently. You taught me that family love is conditional, that sacrifice doesn't guarantee loyalty, and that trust can be exploited without consequence. These are valuable lessons, though not the ones I tried to teach you during the years when I believed motherhood meant something more than convenient access to other people's resources. You forgot that the foundation you built your life on can be removed as deliberately as it was laid. You forgot that the woman who signed papers to make your success possible also signed papers that gave her rights and remedies when that success was built on betrayal. You took my medical fund, but you left me something more valuable: clarity about who you really are and who I need to become to survive what you've done to me. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the photo frame, understanding that both represented the end of one story and the beginning of another. The next time Leo heard from me, it wouldn't be through desperate voicemails or pleading messages. It would be through legal documents that would demonstrate the difference between a victim and someone who'd decided to fight back. The woman who went to sleep that night wasn't the same person who'd discovered the theft 3 weeks earlier. Somewhere in the process of researching my rights and documenting his crimes, I'd found reserves of strength I'd forgotten I possessed. The next phase of this conflict would be fought on my terms, using weapons Leo had foolishly left within my reach. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder and more focused: determination. The morning of my appointment with the bank, I dressed with the same careful attention I'd once given to parent-teacher conferences and Leo's school performances, events where how I presented myself would directly impact his future. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now preparing to destroy that same future with the same methodical precision I'd once used to build it. I chose my most conservative outfit: a navy blue dress that projected competence without ostentation, low heels that suggested stability and reliability, minimal jewelry that wouldn't distract from the gravity of what I needed to communicate. My appearance had to convey exactly the right message: responsible adult, concerned co-signer, someone whose financial judgment could be trusted even when discussing her own son's betrayal. The bank lobby felt different when you entered as someone with leverage, rather than someone begging for mercy. The same marble floors and brass fixtures that had intimidated me during my desperate search for payment plans now seemed like appropriate staging for the kind of serious business conversation I was about to initiate. Richard Castellanos, the senior loan officer, was a man in his 50s who'd probably handled thousands of default situations over his career. His office walls displayed the certificates and awards that established his expertise in risk assessment and debt recovery. Exactly the kind of professional who would understand the implications of what I was about to reveal. "Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for coming in. Your call indicated some concerns about the business loan you co-signed for your son?" His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trained to discuss financial disasters without emotion, to treat family betrayals as routine business matters requiring systematic response. I placed my organized documentation on his desk: bank statements showing the theft, medical records confirming my surgery cancellation, copies of my unsuccessful attempts to reach Leo through phone calls and certified letters. Each document told part of the story I'd rehearsed during sleepless nights, the narrative that would transform Leo from successful borrower to liability requiring immediate attention. "My son stole $70,000 from my medical fund," I said simply, watching Richard's expression shift from professional courtesy to sharp attention. Money I'd saved for cancer surgery that had to be canceled because of his theft. He's refused to return the funds or even acknowledge what he's done. I believe this constitutes the kind of financial irresponsibility that triggers the morality clause in his loan agreement. Richard reviewed my documentation with the focused intensity of someone who understood that family disputes could become institutional problems requiring immediate intervention. He asked clarifying questions about the timeline, the amount stolen, and my efforts to resolve the situation privately before bringing it to the bank's attention. "This is indeed concerning," he said finally, pulling Leo's loan file from his computer and reviewing the terms we'd both signed years earlier. The morality clause specifically addresses situations where borrowers engage in fraudulent or unethical financial behavior. Theft from family members, particularly elderly family members facing medical crises, would certainly qualify. Elderly family members. The phrase stung slightly, highlighting my vulnerability in ways that felt uncomfortable even when they worked in my favor. But I'd learned to use every advantage available, including society's particular horror at children who stole from aging parents facing health emergencies. What are my options as cosigner? I asked, though I'd already researched the answer extensively. I wanted to hear the bank's position directly, to understand exactly how much leverage my documentation had created. Several options, actually. We can declare the loan in immediate default based on the morality clause violation, which would require full repayment within 30 days. We can also pursue asset recovery through legal channels, including forced liquidation of collateral used to secure the original loan. Richard's tone remained professional, but something in his expression suggested he'd seen enough family financial betrayals to feel personal satisfaction when the system provided remedies for victims. The business itself was pledged as collateral, along with business equipment and accounts receivable. Additionally, your son listed several personal assets as additional security: his vehicle, his condominium, investment accounts. All of that could potentially be seized and liquidated to satisfy the debt if he can't arrange immediate payment. The comprehensive nature of Leo's potential losses felt almost overwhelming. Everything he'd built since college, every symbol of his success and independence, could be stripped away to compensate for the medical fund he'd stolen. The punishment would fit the crime perfectly: financial devastation in response to financial betrayal. I should mention, Richard continued, consulting additional notes in the file, that your son's payment history has been increasingly problematic over the past 6 months. Even without the morality clause violation, we were considering calling the loan due to missed payments and insufficient cash flow documentation. This revelation added another layer to my understanding of Leo's desperation when he'd stolen my surgery fund. His business hadn't been thriving as he'd claimed. It had been failing, generating insufficient income to meet basic loan obligations. My medical money hadn't funded some brilliant investment opportunity. It had been used to cover business expenses and personal debts that he couldn't manage through legitimate means. The theft hadn't been opportunistic greed. It had been calculated survival, stealing from his dying mother to preserve a failing business that was already in default. The cruelty of that calculation, the deliberate decision to destroy my medical future to delay his own financial reckoning, crystallized my resolve in ways that surprised me with their intensity. I want to proceed with declaring the loan in default, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was requesting. I want immediate repayment demanded, and if he can't comply, I want asset seizure to begin as quickly as legally possible. Richard nodded with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd handled similar requests many times. I'll need to run this through our legal department for review, but based on the documentation you've provided, I don't anticipate any obstacles. We should be able to issue a default notice within 48 hours, with a 30-day deadline for full repayment. 30 days. In 1 month, Leo would face the complete destruction of everything he'd built, unless he could somehow produce $75,000 to satisfy the loan I'd helped him secure. The same time frame Dr. Martinez had originally given me for my surgery, now applied to Leo's financial survival. The symmetry felt like justice in its purest form. That afternoon, I met with Michelle Roberts at the legal aid office, a cramped space that served dozens of clients who couldn't afford private attorneys but needed professional guidance through complex legal situations. Michelle was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, but her manner suggested experience with family financial abuse cases that had aged her beyond her years. The bank's willingness to pursue immediate default gives us significant leverage for the civil case, she explained after reviewing the documentation I'd shared with Richard. When financial institutions take action based on theft allegations, it strengthens our position considerably if we decide to pursue criminal charges or civil recovery. Criminal charges. The phrase carried weight that went beyond financial consequences into territory that would permanently destroy any possibility of reconciliation between Leo and me. Once I reported him to law enforcement for elder abuse and financial exploitation, our relationship would be finished not just practically but legally, with court records documenting his betrayal for anyone who cared to search public documents. The district attorney's office has been particularly aggressive about prosecuting adult children who steal from elderly parents, Michelle continued. They view it as a growing problem that requires deterrent effects through high-profile prosecutions. Your case has several elements that make it especially compelling: the medical emergency, the substantial amount stolen, the complete refusal to communicate or make restitution. She walked me through the process of filing criminal complaints, explaining how law enforcement would investigate the theft, how prosecutors would evaluate the case for formal charges, and how the civil recovery process would parallel criminal proceedings. Everything could move simultaneously: bank asset seizure, criminal prosecution, and civil lawsuits, all proceeding toward the same goal of holding Leo accountable for his choices. There's one thing you should consider carefully, Michelle said as our consultation concluded. Once this process begins, it becomes very difficult to stop. Criminal charges can't be withdrawn just because family members reconcile. Asset seizures follow legal timelines that don't accommodate changed hearts or belated apologies. You need to be certain you're prepared for all the consequences, including the permanent end of your relationship with your son. The permanent end of our relationship. I'd been grieving that loss for weeks already, mourning the death of a person who'd apparently never existed except in my imagination. The Leo who could steal his mother's cancer treatment fund and then disappear into silence had already ended our relationship. I was simply making that ending official through legal channels. I'm certain, I said, meaning it completely for the first time since this nightmare began. That evening, I sat in my kitchen and called Dr. Martinez's office to schedule a follow-up appointment, not to beg for payment plans or charitable assistance, but to discuss rescheduling my surgery for 6 weeks from now. The amount of time Michelle estimated it would take for asset seizure and recovery to provide the funds I needed for treatment. Mrs. Rodriguez, it's so good to hear from you, Maria said when she recognized my voice. We've been hoping you'd found a way to resolve the financial issues. I have, I said simply. It's going to take about 6 weeks to liquidate some family assets, but I should have the funds for surgery by then. Is Dr. Martinez's schedule still flexible enough to accommodate that timeline? The phrase, liquidate family assets, felt strange in my mouth, a euphemism that made Leo's impending financial destruction sound like routine estate planning rather than the systematic demolition of everything he'd built through my sacrifices and his theft. But euphemisms made difficult truths easier to speak, and I'd discovered that speaking difficult truths was becoming easier with practice. Let me check his calendar, Maria said, and I could hear keyboard clicking as she searched for available dates. It looks like we have an opening in 7 weeks that would work perfectly. Dr. Martinez will be pleased. He's been very concerned about the delay in your treatment. 7 weeks. Long enough for Leo to receive his default notice, fail to produce $75,000, and watch his entire adult life disappear through asset seizure and legal action. Long enough for the stolen medical fund to be recovered through court-ordered liquidation of everything he'd thought was his, but had actually been built on my foundation. Long enough for justice to be served before I underwent the surgery that would, with any luck, give me many more years to appreciate the lesson I was about to teach about consequences and accountability. When I hung up the phone, I realized I was smiling for the first time in a month. The default notice arrived at Leo's office on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail that required his personal signature, a detail I'd specifically requested to ensure he couldn't claim ignorance about the 30-day deadline for full loan repayment. The bank's legal department had crafted the document with surgical precision, citing both missed payments and moral turpitude violations that triggered immediate acceleration of the entire debt. I knew the exact moment he received it because my phone rang 17 minutes later, the first contact he'd initiated since stealing my medical fund 6 weeks earlier. His name appeared on my caller ID like a ghost, materializing from a past I'd systematically dismantled through legal paperwork and strategic planning. I let it ring 4 times before answering, savoring each electronic chime that announced his panic while demonstrating my newfound control over our interactions. When I finally picked up, I used the same neutral tone bank officers employed when discussing foreclosures and asset seizures: professional, detached, completely devoid of the maternal warmth he'd taken for granted his entire life. "Hello, Leo." "Mom, what the hell is this?" His voice carried a combination of outrage and disbelief that suggested he'd never considered the possibility that his actions might have consequences. The bank is saying I have 30 days to pay back the entire business loan. They're claiming some kind of morality violation. This has to be a mistake. Not, I'm sorry for stealing your cancer fund. Not, I understand why you're angry. Not even acknowledgement that his current crisis might be connected to his systematic destruction of our relationship. Just immediate assumption that this was some kind of administrative error that I should help him resolve, because surely his mother wouldn't deliberately jeopardize his financial success. It's not a mistake, I said calmly, each word delivered with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation countless times. I provided the bank with documentation of your theft from my medical account. Stealing $70,000 from your mother's cancer treatment fund qualifies as the kind of moral turpitude that voids loan agreements. The silence that followed was profound enough to suggest he was experiencing the first genuine shock of his adult life. For 34 years, he'd operated under the assumption that family relationships provided unlimited immunity from consequences, that maternal love meant perpetual forgiveness regardless of the depth of his betrayals. You reported me to the bank? When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Higher, more strained, carrying notes of panic that I'd never heard before. Mom, this will destroy my business. Everything I've built. Everything I've worked for. You can't do this over money. Over money. As if the $70,000 he'd stolen represented spare change rather than my life savings. As if the surgery he'd made impossible was some kind of optional luxury rather than medical treatment that could determine whether I lived or died. His ability to minimize the magnitude of his theft while magnifying the importance of his consequences revealed everything I needed to know about his character. You did this to yourself when you chose to steal my medical fund, I replied, my voice steady despite the satisfaction I felt watching him discover that actions could indeed have consequences, even for adult children who'd never experienced real accountability. I didn't create this situation. I'm simply ensuring that it's resolved according to legal channels rather than family favoritism. But I can explain everything. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable now, the sound of someone who'd finally realized that charm and manipulation wouldn't work on a mother who'd stopped being susceptible to his influence. The investment opportunity was time-sensitive. I was going to replace the money within 6 months, maybe sooner. You would have made a profit on the whole transaction. 6 months. The tumor in my chest wouldn't have waited 6 months for him to decide whether his investment gambles had succeeded. Dr. Martinez had been explicit about the risks of delayed treatment, the way each month of postponement reduced the likelihood of successful recovery. Leo had been willing to bet my life on his business instincts, to gamble with my survival for the possibility of profit. The bank requires full payment within 30 days, I said, cutting through his explanations with the finality of someone who'd moved beyond negotiation into enforcement. $75,000. If you can't produce that amount, they'll begin asset seizure proceedings. Your business, your car, your condominium, everything pledged as collateral will be liquidated to satisfy the debt. Mom, please. The word please sounded foreign coming from him, unfamiliar and desperate in ways that suggested he'd rarely needed to beg for anything in his life. There has to be some way to work this out. I'll get the money back to you somehow. I'll take out another loan, sell some investments. Just call the bank and tell them you want to withdraw the complaint. Another loan, more investments. He was still thinking in terms of financial engineering, rather than acknowledging the fundamental betrayal that had destroyed our relationship. Even facing the complete destruction of his adult life, he couldn't grasp that this wasn't really about money. It was about character, accountability, and the consequences of treating family love as a resource to be exploited without permission. I've already filed criminal charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation, I said, delivering the information with surgical precision. The district attorney's office is reviewing the case for formal prosecution. Calling the bank wouldn't stop that process even if I wanted to, which I don't. Criminal charges. The phrase hit him like a physical blow, judging by the sharp intake of breath and extended silence that followed. For the first time in our conversation, he seemed to understand that this wasn't a family dispute that could be resolved through emotional manipulation, but a legal matter that would proceed according to systematic processes he couldn't control or influence. You're having me arrested? The disbelief in his voice was complete, as if the idea that stealing from your mother might result in criminal prosecution had never occurred to him. Mom, I'm your son. How can you do this to your own child? Your own child. He'd finally remembered our relationship, but only when it served his purposes. Only when he needed to invoke family bonds he'd systematically violated through months of theft and abandonment. The irony was perfect. The person who'd stolen my cancer fund and then refused to return my phone calls was now appealing to maternal sentiment he'd already proven meant nothing to him. My own child stole my medical fund and disappeared for 6 weeks while I canceled life-saving surgery, I replied, my voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every difficult breath, every moment of terror when I'd thought I might die because of his selfishness. My own child chose his business investments over his mother's survival. You taught me that family relationships are conditional, Leo. Now you're learning the same lesson. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, his arguments becoming increasingly frantic as he cycled through denial, bargaining, and rage without ever reaching genuine remorse or accountability. He threatened to contest the charges, promised to return money he couldn't access, and finally resorted to emotional manipulation that revealed how little he understood about the woman I'd become during his absence. "This isn't who you are, Mom," he said finally, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone who'd never bothered to know who I actually was beneath the maternal role he'd assigned me. "You're kind, forgiving. You don't destroy people's lives over mistakes." Mistakes? 6 weeks after stealing $70,000 from his dying mother, he was still characterizing his deliberate theft as an error in judgment rather than a calculated betrayal. The distance between his self-perception and reality was so vast that bridging it would require acknowledgement of truths he seemed psychologically incapable of accepting. "You're right," I said quietly. "The person who raised you would have forgiven anything, excused anything, sacrificed anything to protect you from consequences. But that person died when you stole my cancer fund and chose your business over my life. You created the woman you're talking to now, Leo. This is who you made me become." When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. The conversation had confirmed everything I'd discovered about his character, while providing the satisfaction of watching him finally confront reality without the protective buffer of family immunity. 3 days later, the asset seizure began. Court-ordered liquidation of his business equipment, his luxury car towed from the downtown parking garage where he'd displayed it as evidence of his success, his condominium listed for forced sale with proceeds designated for debt recovery. Everything he'd built using my financial foundation was systematically dismantled to restore what he'd stolen from me. The local business journal ran a small article about the asset seizure, describing it as a cautionary tale about over-leveraging and moral hazard in small business lending. They didn't mention that the business owner had stolen from his mother's medical fund, but anyone who read between the lines could understand the broader implications of financial misconduct leading to complete professional destruction. I clipped the article and put it in my file alongside the bank statements, legal documents, and medical records that told the complete story of his choices and their consequences. Evidence of accountability finally achieved, justice served through systematic application of laws designed to protect people like me from people like him. The day before my rescheduled surgery, I received a final phone call from Leo. No longer the confident businessman who'd dismissed my medical crisis as manageable through creative financing, but a broken man who'd lost everything he'd thought defined his worth and identity. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried what sounded like genuine remorse. "I know it's too late, but I need you to know that I'm sorry for everything, for the money, for abandoning you, for being the kind of person who could steal from his own mother. Too late." Finally, he understood something true about consequences and accountability, about the way some choices couldn't be undone through belated apologies or desperate remorse. The surgery would proceed as scheduled, funded by the recovery of assets he'd accumulated using my sacrifices as foundation. "Yes," I said simply, "it is too late." But I was finally free. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early autumn, when the hospital corridors filled with golden light that made even the antiseptic hallways feel warm and hopeful. I arrived early, not because of anxiety about the procedure, but because I wanted time to appreciate how different this experience felt compared to the canceled appointment that had started this entire ordeal. This time, I walked through those automatic doors as someone who'd fought for her right to be there, who'd reclaimed her medical fund through strategic action rather than family charity. The woman checking in for Dr. Martinez's surgical schedule wasn't the broken victim who'd once begged her son for mercy, but someone who'd learned that dignity came from refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, even from people you'd loved, unconditionally. Dr. Martinez met with me in preoperative consultation, reviewing the surgical plan we'd discussed months earlier when my future had seemed dependent on Leo's cooperation and goodwill. His manner was the same, professional, optimistic about the procedure's success, but something in his eyes suggested he understood that more than medical healing would happen in his operating room today. Your insurance has confirmed coverage, and our billing department shows that you've satisfied all financial requirements, he said, consulting his tablet with the satisfaction of someone who'd seen too many patients postpone necessary treatment for economic reasons. I'm glad we were able to work out the timing. The delay wasn't ideal, but the tumor hasn't progressed as much as I'd feared. The tumor hadn't progressed, but I certainly had. The woman preparing for surgery bore little resemblance to the one who'd discovered her son's theft and collapsed in a grocery store from the shock of betrayal. That person had been defined by her relationships, her value determined by how well she served other people's needs and ambitions. This person understood that self-worth couldn't be stolen or borrowed or redistributed. It existed independently of anyone else's recognition or approval. I'm ready, I said, meaning more than just surgical preparation. I was ready for the recovery that would follow, ready for the years of life that Leo's theft had briefly threatened, ready for whatever came next in a future that belonged entirely to me. The procedure lasted 4 hours, during which time the asset recovery from Leo's forced liquidation was finalized through court-ordered sale of his remaining possessions. By the time I woke up in recovery, groggy but breathing freely for the first time in months, the account that had once held my medical fund had been restored to its original balance plus legal fees and accumulated interest. Justice had a mathematical precision that felt more satisfying than any emotional reconciliation could have provided. $70,000 stolen, $75,000 recovered through asset seizure. The extra $5,000 represented the cost of his education and consequences, tuition for learning that theft from family members carried penalties that compounded over time. The first person I saw when I fully regained consciousness was Ellen Morrison, my neighbor who'd somehow learned about my surgery and appointed herself my temporary advocate during recovery. She sat beside my hospital bed with knitting needles and a ball of yellow yarn, creating something useful while keeping watch over my emergence back into the world of the living. "How do you feel, honey?" Ellen asked, setting aside her project to lean closer and examine my face for signs of pain or distress. "The nurses say everything went perfectly." Dr. Martinez was very pleased with how smoothly the procedure went. "Different," I said, testing my voice and finding it stronger than expected. "I feel different." Different was an understatement. The physical relief of being able to breathe without effort was profound, but the emotional transformation was even more dramatic. The weight I'd carried for months, fear about my medical future, anxiety about family relationships, confusion about my own worth and agency, had been lifted through systematic action rather than wishful thinking. Ellen stayed through visiting hours, updating me on neighborhood news and carefully avoiding any mention of Leo or the legal proceedings that had funded my recovery. She understood, with the intuitive wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to witness every variety of family dysfunction, that some subjects were too raw for hospital room conversations. But when she was gathering her knitting supplies to leave for the evening, she paused and looked at me with an expression that suggested she'd been preparing this observation throughout her visit. "You know," Ellen said slowly, "I've been thinking about something you said months ago, about how you'd raised Leo to be kind and empathetic. I think you did raise him that way, Marisa. Some people just choose to grow out of the lessons their mothers teach them. Some people choose to grow out of the lessons their mothers teach them." The phrase provided a framework for understanding that felt both accurate and liberating. I hadn't failed as a mother. I'd succeeded in teaching values that Leo had deliberately discarded when they conflicted with his personal ambitions. His character flaws weren't evidence of my inadequacy, but proof of his own choices about what kind of person he wanted to become. During my week-long hospital stay, I received exactly one communication from Leo, a brief email sent through his attorney, formally acknowledging the asset seizure and confirming that he wouldn't contest the criminal charges pending against him. The message was professionally written, legally precise, and completely devoid of personal sentiment. It read like a business communication between strangers, rather than any kind of familial correspondence. The emotional distance in that email felt like a gift rather than an insult. He'd finally stopped pretending that our relationship could survive what he'd done to it, stopped trying to manipulate my maternal instincts to avoid accountability for his choices. The clean break was exactly what I needed to move forward without the constant possibility that he might someday expect forgiveness he'd never earned. My recovery progressed ahead of Dr. Martinez's most optimistic projections. Within 3 weeks, I was breathing normally, sleeping through the night without episodes of respiratory distress, and feeling physically stronger than I had in over a year. The successful surgery had eliminated the immediate threat to my life, but more importantly, it had validated my decision to fight for my own survival when the person who should have been my advocate had chosen to become my adversary. 6 weeks after surgery, I received a letter from the district attorney's office informing me that Leo had accepted a plea agreement for elder abuse and financial exploitation. The terms included full restitution, already satisfied through asset recovery, plus 2 years of supervised probation and mandatory counseling for financial crimes against family members. The criminal conviction would remain on his record permanently, affecting his ability to work in financial services or any position requiring fiduciary responsibility. His professional credentials had been suspended pending review by state licensing boards, who took a dim view of theft from vulnerable family members. The business he'd built using my support as foundation had been not just destroyed, but rendered impossible to rebuild in any similar form. The comprehensive nature of his professional destruction felt proportionate to the medical crisis his theft had created. He'd gambled with my life for business advantage. Now his business prospects had been permanently compromised by his willingness to steal from family. The symmetry was perfect, consequences that matched crimes in both scope and severity. But the most profound change wasn't in Leo's circumstances. It was in my own understanding of what I deserved from relationships and what I was willing to accept. The woman who'd once prioritized everyone else's needs above her own survival had been replaced by someone who understood that self-preservation wasn't selfish, that boundaries weren't cruelty, and that accountability wasn't optional even within families. 3 months after surgery, I started volunteering at the hospital's financial counseling center, helping other patients navigate the complex intersection of medical crises and economic limitations. My experience with payment plans, insurance coverage, and legal remedies for family financial abuse made me uniquely qualified to guide people through systems I'd learned to navigate through necessity. The work was more fulfilling than anything I'd done during my years of retail employment. Each conversation with a desperate patient reminded me of my own journey from victim to advocate. Each success story validated my understanding that knowledge and persistence could overcome even the most overwhelming obstacles. Many of the families I counseled were dealing with similar betrayals: adult children who'd stolen medical funds, spouses who'd hidden critical financial information, relatives who'd exploited trust for personal gain. I learned that my experience with Leo wasn't unique, that family financial abuse was epidemic among people facing medical crises, but that legal remedies existed for those willing to pursue them. 1 year after my surgery, I moved into a smaller apartment that required no co-signers or family guarantees, a space that belonged entirely to me without any legal connections to people who might view my resources as available for their exploitation. The independence felt revolutionary after decades of financial entanglement with someone who'd ultimately used every connection as leverage for theft. The apartment had large windows that filled the living room with morning sunlight, a small kitchen perfect for cooking meals I chose and paid for myself, and a bedroom where I slept peacefully without worrying about breathing episodes or family betrayals. It was exactly what I needed, a sanctuary that reflected my values, rather than accommodating someone else's ambitions. I never heard from Leo again after that final email through his attorney. Friends occasionally asked about him, neighbors wondered why he'd stopped visiting, but I'd learned to deflect those inquiries with simple honesty. We're no longer in contact. The phrase was sufficient to end most conversations without requiring detailed explanations about theft, asset seizure, or criminal convictions. The silence where his presence used to be felt peaceful rather than lonely. I'd discovered that solitude chosen freely was entirely different from isolation imposed by others, that independence earned through struggle was more valuable than security dependent on other people's continued goodwill. 5 years later, when Dr. Martinez pronounced me completely cancer-free during my annual follow-up appointment, I understood that I'd won more than just a medical victory. I'd reclaimed my life from someone who'd tried to steal it, proven that quiet strength could overcome loud betrayal, and learned that sometimes the most profound act of love was refusing to enable the people who took advantage of it. The woman who walked out of that final appointment bore no resemblance to the one who discovered her son's theft in a bank lobby years earlier. This person understood her own worth, defended her own interests, and accepted only the treatment she deserved from everyone in her life. I'd learned that sometimes, when people show you who they really are, the most appropriate response isn't forgiveness, it's simply believing them and acting accordingly. Some lessons can only be taught through consequences, and some relationships can only be preserved through their deliberate ending. In the silence Leo had chosen, I'd found my voice. In the space his absence created, I'd discovered myself. The theft that was supposed to destroy me had instead revealed reserves of strength I'd never known I possessed. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply refusing to remain a victim when someone decides to make you one.